Hello, everyone. We'll just wait a moment here while everyone logs in, and we'll get started. Okay, welcome to California Wine Institute's Behind the Wines with our host, Elaine Chukan Brown. Thank you all for taking the time out to be with us today. This month, our host, Elaine, has been leading conversations with some outstanding producers dedicated to illustrating California terroir through the lens of classic grape varieties: Zinfandel, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Cabernet Sauvignon. While the conversations offer a deeper understanding of these varieties and the role they play in the history of California wine, more importantly, we hope they reveal the new directions grape growers and winemakers are headed in the way they cultivate and work with them in the cellar. Today, we have the privilege of welcoming Rodrigo Soto, Rebekah Wineburg, and Pedro Parra. So before we get started, some housekeeping reminders for everyone. During the webinar, note that there are two communication methods available to participants that we encourage you to use. There is a chat section as well as a Q&A section. These are different. The chat section is an informal way for you to communicate with other participants. Just be sure to select everyone in the to field, as it can default to panelists only. Then there's the Q&A section, and this is where we'd like you to submit your questions for Elaine and our guests to answer towards the end of the webinar. So we will do our best to address your questions, but please know any that are not answered live will be provided in the Q&A summary in the email you'll receive following the program. In this email, we will also provide a list of export markets for the wines presented. Now I'd like to introduce our host, Elaine. In addition to writing for her own site, Waka Waka Wine Reviews, she serves as the American specialist for JancysRobinson.com and contributes to a long list of respected publications. She contributed to the 8th edition of the World Atlas of Wine, which has won multiple awards very recently, as well as the award-winning 4th edition of the Oxford Companion to Wine. She was named by the International Wine and Spirits Competition and Italy as one of the world's top 5 wine communicators of the year for the last 2 years in a row. And our guests for this episode: a champion of organic and biodynamic farming, Rodrigo Soto is the estate director of Quintessa and has been with the winery since 2018. Since 2015, Rebekah Wineburg, winemaker at Quintessa, has brought a worldly perspective to the cultivation and production of luxury wines in Napa Valley. And Pedro Parra, PhD in terroir viticole, a wine terroir consultant and wine producer in Chile, who has 18 years of experience working with French, Italian, Spanish, and American terroirs. Now, Elaine, I'll turn it over to you.
Hello, I'm so happy to see all of you, and I want to make sure everyone understands that Pedro is calling in from Chile, from Concepcion, and so thank you very much for making time to do that. I'm thrilled to have all three of you here today, because one of the things that I think is not talked about enough is that wine really comes from a team. And so while it's much harder to interview a whole team on a webinar like this, I actually think it's very important to take the time to do that and to understand the different roles that members of a team can have in making and growing a wine, and the way a team can work together as well. And so thank you, all three of you, for agreeing to have this conversation today. So one of the things that I'm excited about too is Quintessa, I think, is this incredible example of an estate-run program. So the fruit is the wine comes from just the estate itself, but a really unique estate there in Napa Valley, and also a really unique perspective, I think, within Napa Valley. And so that's one of the things we want to talk about today. But to start, Rebekah, I was hoping you could go ahead and kind of help us understand the story, because the way Quintessa gets founded, I think, is unique in its history and also now. Could you tell us about how did they find the site and what was the focus then?
Sure. Thanks, Elaine. Quintessa really is, like you said, this unique property within Napa Valley, and was founded by Agustin and Valeria Huneeus, who are originally from Chile, the obvious Chilean connection we have, in 1989. So Agustin and Valeria have been working in the wine industry for, since the 1960s. at that point, and they were working in Napa Valley and looking. Augustine was running Franciscan wine estates. He was partner and president of that property, and Valeria was running vineyards, and they were looking for a property that would be something that they could hold on to and create a great wine estate that would be equal and eventually equal to great wine estates in the world. And so Valeria was driving up and down California looking for this piece of land that would be this whatever. And she happened to find this flyer for what was called the Mardikian property at the time. So this is in Rutherford. And now we're going to talk and show people the map. But Rutherford, for those of you who don't know, is the historic heart of Napa Valley. And Napa Valley is actually quite small. We're only 30 miles north to south, maybe like 5 miles east to west. This was in the 1980s. It had already become fairly planted to grapevines. So this was this incredible find to find this property in Rutherford. We're of a decent size, we're 250 acres that has, and here's the really cool part, had never been planted before, had never been farmed. So this was virgin land. And Valeria walked on.
And just to clarify, you don't only mean that it was never planted to grapes, it's that it was literally never been planted or farmed.
It had literally never been planted or farmed. So that kind of opportunity is incredible. And then there's the question, is this going to be a great place to grow grapes? And so Valeria walked onto the property and immediately felt that this was a property that had something to say. And so the family was able to purchase the land in 1989, and Quintessa began in 1990. So you have this amazing property, and you have this incredible couple who fully understands, deeply understands the importance of wine and culture, how to grow these grapes. And what is so incredible at the time is that Valeria immediately knew she did not want to be a user, an extractor of this land. She wanted to be the family to be stewards of the property. And all of us who are involved with Quintessa are stewards of this property. And so she took the effort and the time in 1989, when we originally planted, to farm organically. So this is a property that's never had synthetic chemicals used. Mm-hmm. And we also didn't cut any trees down in the development of the property. So we worked with the natural contours of the land, which are pretty unique.
Mm-hmm. And there's even, in fact, a rather large oak grove that's intact. Yeah. Yeah.
So of this 250 acres, only about 150, well, currently right now 130 are planted. So there's quite a bit of the property that is native oak woodland, and we have a lake. Those are very important parts of the property. I remember the very first time I walked onto this property, and I immediately felt like this was a very special property. I've worked in Napa Valley for about 17 years now. I've worked with a lot of different vineyards here, and there is something special about Quintessa. It really has a soul. When you work as a winemaker, your job is to interpret the piece of land. And when you have a piece of land that has a very strong voice, that's a much easier job. And this is that kind of property. Mm-hmm. So we run from the Vaca mountain range all the way to the Napa River. We have a lot of diversity on the property. We're planted to Bordeaux varieties. But the name of the wine is the name of the property. And that's important because this property expresses the soul of, this wine expresses the soul of this property. Right. So I'll tell you when we're tasting the wine what the breakdown is, but I've told you before this, it doesn't matter so much to me what the percentages of the different varieties are. What matters is the expression of the entire property altogether.
Well, and so one of the things I want to highlight here, just to give a sense of historic context. So again, the property, they started planting in 1989. The project was led by both Augustine and Valeria, but in actuality, Valeria was the one who had the vision and designed the vineyard and made the choices about how to farm and how to plant. So a project of this size being led by a woman at the time is really quite significant, but also the Organic Food Act in the United States was not implemented until 1990. So for them to come in and immediately understand the organic farming choice was the way to go is really quite significant. It was not such an obvious part of our culture's thinking at the time. And so it really was a very forward-thinking choice. But let's go ahead and look at maps so that people understand where we're located and get a better sense of the texture of the state. So of course, since we're talking to people from all over the world, we want to, of course, help understand where in California we are. Do remember that the Pacific Ocean there on the left, the current that runs along the California coast is actually the second coldest current in the world. The coldest current in the world is along the Chilean coast. And also note the complex of bays there around San Francisco, because that plays an important role with Napa Valley. Then as we keep zooming in, Katie always does such a great job making these Google Earth maps. What you want to notice here is all of the dark green areas, you can see those are actually forests set on mountains. And as we keep zooming in, notice Napa is at the top of the Bay complex, of course, and then this kind of helps focus in on Napa Valley. You can see there on the western or left-hand side, that's the Mayacamas mountain range. And then on kind of down the middle on the right-hand side is the Vaca range. And that's really important. As Quintessa, you can see there is hugged up against the Vaca. And as we zoom in even more, notice again, this shot gives such a great view of the texture of the valley, and that you can see it's really informed by the role of the mountains. And I think as we get closer, you can see there kind of vaguely in this picture, the Napa River. And so in talking about Quintessa, the interaction of the mountains with the river really helps define the complexity of the site. And I think we've got one more map. So just to orient us here, the top of the map is actually facing east, the Vaca range that we were just looking at. And so the left would be towards the north. But this is a map that shows the texture and topography and the block breakdown of the site. But what I'd love to really get into here with you, Pedro, you've literally worked on vineyards literally all over the world. You actually have extensive training. Your training was in France, but you actually spent years in Bordeaux. And you know, as Katie mentioned, have worked with vineyards all over Europe and all over the New World as well. But in speaking with you about Quintessa, you've commented on how this is really one of the most complex sites you've seen in Napa Valley. Could you speak to the complexity of the estate?
Thank you very much, Elaine. And of course, I will try to get an idea about that. You know, normally when you think on Napa Valley, you think in this kind of flat, you know, flat, deep clay soils that brings one kind of typicity of the wines. This is what people all around the world get as a message from Napa Valley. And many of the wines are producing this style of you know, of typicity. But Napa Valley is way more complex in terms of topography and in terms of geology. And normally, many times, we tend to simplify everything because we don't pay attention, because we don't think it's necessary. And in my experience, the most important part of that is that the wine that you make is the wine that your terroir allows you to make. So to really have a typicity and to be a great producer, you need to understand who you are in terms of terroir. And in this case, just to get an idea, Quintessa is more like a, you know, hills terroir and not flat, and is composed by different geological volcanic phenomenon that makes a huge complexity and diversity, and something that I really like because it's like cooking. You have more ingredient, you know, to blend at the end of the day. But very important to me, I think that the approach that we are trying to do for 20 years in the property, but now more in a more intense way, I think, we are doing Burgundy in Napa. This is our scale of work. And when I'm saying Burgundy, I'm saying that every small site has a Burgundian scale. So that
Meaning
means that
smaller.
it's very small. So
Yeah.
the micro, we were working 2 days ago with Rodrigo, in a new plantation that's going to be developed. Just to get an idea, it's about 4 hectares. But in 4 hectares, we have more or less 8 or 7 different terroir expressions in 4 hectares. So what is the classical approach? Is you get 4 hectares, you made 1 block, and you plant with 1 grape, and you get 1 wine in the tank. The diversity that we have in this property is so big that your winery should be full of many small tanks, and it's what is happening in Bordeaux today. I remember when I was starting, my career in 2002 or 2003, and I went back to Bordeaux with Pierre Becheler, which is a great, terroir consultant. I remember every place that we were visiting, they were rebuilding the winery. And why they were rebuilding the winery is because they normally got this big, 20 hectoliters, 15 hectoliters tank. And the soil variability with the global warming were pushing them, to a more precise scale. Because the question is, how many great wines are damaged with 5% of a very bad terroir in the final blend, Can you imagine that? And so it's like, you get 90% of the site fantastic and 10% of the site is horrible because you have something, a horrible clay or something terrible that happened. And so at the end, you don't realize that, but you're putting everything together.
And normally in the wine, right?
Yes, of course. And what happened is that this tank is going to be tasted by the winemaker in Bordeaux, and it's going to say second wine, not first wine. Okay.
Great.
So that means this tank is going to be 100% in the second one. But what happens if you put this 10% of, let's say, caca outside, and you get 90% purity of the terroir, the beautiful gravel? This wine is going to be the first wine, and maybe one of the top first wine. So I remember that, and I was so impressed. I remember having that discussion with Pierre. One of his very old clients is Chateau Cos d'Estournel. 30 hectares of 81 were going to the first wine, historically. After, this kind of terroir liposuction, 51 hectares going to the first wine. Can you imagine how much money they are doing, those guys?
Yeah.
They are almost doing 50% extra of the best wine, only putting small places out, liposuction. Right. So basically, Bordeaux is going Burgundy in the scale.
Well, and I think, I think this is a really important point to kind of draw a circle around, because I think sometimes in a wine conversation, when we say something like Burgundy, from a New World perspective, we assume we mean Pinot, but actually what we mean is a way of thinking, a historical way of thinking, a culture of wine. And the truth is that the contrast between Burgundy and Bordeaux is not simply varieties grown. It's actually a historical culture of wine and what it means to grow wine and what it means to make wine. And one of the great benefits of wine today is that we have the opportunity, exactly like what we're doing now, having a global conversation and realizing that when we ask, how do we treat this estate, we don't just mean what should we plant and grow here, we mean what perspective do we want to bring to our work. And that's one of the things I think is so important about the work Quintessa does, is that from the very beginning, Quintessa's understand we must have a global perspective, because our goal is to work only with this one place. That means we can't improve it by going to other places. It means we must always improve our perspective of this place. One of the things that I want to point out with the map that we were just looking at is just that, part of the point you were making, I take it, is that with this particular vineyard, the goal is with an estate wine, it would be easy to assume, okay, we use everything from the estate to make the estate wine. But Pedro, I take it part of what you're getting at is that actually, if we fine tune more and more and more, and get more and more specific about how we farm and which parts we take, then we can make a better and better estate wine, but we might not use all of the estate. Can you speak to how, like the way that the mountains and the river do interact to form the different sections of this site?
Because what happened, and normally the more close you are to the biggest mountains, this is going to happen more and more. Is the case in Quintessa. What you get is different volcanic eruptions, and volcanic tectonic phenomena that create, the whole area. And then, because there is mountains, you have rivers going down from the upper part to the lower part. Every river is like a train, So when you're moving, you have different options. You have a train going to Paris, a train going to Rome, a train going to London. So the things that they are not bringing the same people. So they are not bringing the same origin.
Right.
So when people say there is one river going down Napa, I would say no, there is one main river. But you need to have your idea, 10 millions of years behind, when that land was very savage, everything was very intense. So there were many, many rivers going down. One maybe was the main river, but then there were another rivers in the same movement. So normally what you get is always you get the youngest river, which is in the flat area because it's the most soft movement, but you also get more ancient and strongest alluvial, we call that alluvial, terraces because they get formed like that. So how is possible, for example, that in the upper part of the mountain, in the center of Quintessa, we have gravels? The gravels cannot fly.
Right.
So the only way was to have a very strong, ultra strong alluvial movement that was strong enough to bring gravels in the upper part of the vineyard and big boulders, big gravels. It's not like Bordeaux, like, 3-4 centimeters. We're talking 10 centimeters gravels. So that means that we have a complexity in the alluvial phenomenon all around the property. And when we don't get that, we get in situ volcanic eruptions with fantastic, stony, silty, white terroir. And then when you go down, as you see, there is a small lake, you go to the classical movement where all the rivers were going, That's why you got different kind of stones. Because remember, every river comes from a different place, a different home. So it's chaos. It's geological chaos that you have in one property. It's not very common in Napa. I have worked in other properties, it's way more simple. Here you have a fantastic geological chaos that makes you to have infinity options to plant for viticulture. Rodrigo, as a viticulturist and organic and biodynamic, every site has an energy. The role of Rodrigo is to capture that energy, and the role of Rebekah is to transform that energy into a wine. And then one day, find a way to blend that and make the best wine in Napa.
Yes. So it's so important what we're describing here. We often will talk about, it's volcanic soil, so that's good. Except actually part of what you're getting at is even on one mountain, there could be lots of different volcanic moments that create with different temperatures, different formations, totally different effects on soil production. But then also lots of different alluvial or water formations as well.
And everything is volcanic, but saying volcanic is like saying people, you are American.
Right.
Really what means to be American? You are American, Italian American, you have British American, Irish, Mexican American. Is volcanics just a simple word to say something, Is one kind of igneous rock made of magma that went out. How it went out, there are many, many ways. So remember, high quality wine is about details. Yes. And small difference make a huge difference in the vineyard. In this case, the family is volcanic, but we have like 10 different expressions of the volcanics. That's why it's so interesting. And people tend to generalize. Okay, Napa volcanic, but it's way more complicated than that. The problem is that you need to pay attention to be able to see the differences. When you know the differences, you need to have a great viticulturist who can understand that things are different, not the same. One main problem with many viticultures is that they tend to homogenize everything. It's like having the same haircut, same stylist. But when you homogenize everything, what you're doing is erasing the difference. And the difference are making your site fantastic. Why you want to erase something that makes your wine fantastic? So we need to find the different energies, and we need to learn how to interpret that. And this is the funny part, the difficult one. But it's the super funny part, Can you imagine for 50 years, one terroir making the same wine every year? It's like a punishment, that is horrible. Here, you don't have time for that because you have so many different terroirs, different irrigation system. You cannot irrigate in the same way. Different rootstocks, different grapes, different clones, different organic biodynamic methods, different way making. Everything is different. So that is fascinating. And not many properties give you that opportunity. That is the great part of that.
Right. So, speaking to farming, Rodrigo, one of the things, I've been able to walk vineyards in multiple countries with you. And the thing that has always struck me about you, again, is that sense of perspective. What perspective are you coming from? And so in trying to listen and feel my way into how you approach things, my impression has always been that you have this really lovely combination of being a very holistic thinker who approaches each detailed place to see what's best here. And so it's very much a combination of the kinds of things that Pedro was just talking about. But I know with Quintessa in particular, you have a strong interest in looking at how can we improve the way we farm and approach all of these detailed, complex parts of the property so that the wine also improves in detail and quality. Can you speak to that role of organic and biodynamic farming and just the health of the vines and the complexity of the site? How do those things all come together in your work?
Yeah, Elaine, that well, thank you for the invitation and for the question. That what's interesting about what Pedro was saying is that I remember that visit to Cos de Surnel many years ago. We were together with Pierre Bachelet and we were having the same conversation. And for me, Quintessa was something very similar to that conversation. The wines, when I start working over here, the wines were very good, and there has been a history. So where I can add any value to that conversation? And then you start realizing and going backwards in time and thinking about that same conversation with Pedro and Pierre Bachelet at the time. How can we make this, how we can find another layer of understanding, how we can get deeper in this, and how we can definitely decipher if there's anything else that can be done. And when you start scratching the surface, you realize, wow, there's no one thing. There are many, many things that we can reveal out of this property. But there's one thing that is very important to understand, is that without the 25 years prior, it's impossible to understand where you stand for. Mm-hmm. It's impossible to recognize that, okay, we have done very well up to now. What's next? You need to put yourself in the context of the history of the property and the evolution of the wines. And I think that's a very important conversation to have, because as we taste in one of your visits over here, we did a vertical tasting that was very revealing. You can taste the different eras, and being a blind taste, you really like the current times, mm-hmm. and which are very important, because then you start finding the synergies. You start finding, okay, Rebekah is doing an outstanding work with the interpretation. How we can find more chapters of this book that was dismantled millions of years ago, and we can start putting these chapters together so that we can start finding more and more of those brilliant interpretations in the winery and facilitate that through the farming process. One of the things that relates to me that Pedro just said that is very important. The generalizations are awful in what we do because they completely erase the fingerprint of the property. So the details is what makes the difference. The blocks were planted in a certain way with the knowledge of the time, and probably was the best knowledge of the time. But today we know a lot more. So how we can break that apart in order to really select those areas carefully, make them differently, make the proper interpretation of that particular site, and come up with a completely different puzzle. The puzzle started with 100 pieces, and it may end up with 1,000 pieces. It's going to be a lot more complex, and it's going to be a lot more work, but it's going to be a lot more fun, as Pedro said. I think that's the important part. And biodynamics, in my opinion, more than the technique, that everybody tries to focus in mentioning the techniques, it teaches you and it shows you how to observe. And I think that is the most important thing of everything, the observation, not only of the vineyard, but as Rebekah said, the surroundings of the vineyard. How many different types of oak are around the property? What is the character that the native trees of this property gives to the grapes so that it translates into the wine? How many different soil types we have in a single block? All those elements, in my opinion, are the ones that start putting parts together and allowing you to understand. The raw component is so important. I mean, and when you think about it, this is the type of observation that, in my opinion, is part of the future. Because when you think about it, you tend to kind of take out elements of the environment rather than bring them in. We tend to clear the land. We tend to, crazy, huh? Take all the rocks out of the block because they bother our tractors and stuff like that. There's a fascination of taking the rocks out. This is an obsession. And look at what Pedro is saying. You're taking the DNA of your site because you have this fascination with the D10 of taking the rocks out. So those elements, in my opinion, are very maybe farm driven, but they have nothing to do with winemaking, and they have nothing to do with the expression of the land or that particular site. And I think that's very important, at least to acknowledge and to have the conversation, because I understand there's practicalities, but also don't forget, practicalities equal generalization.
Right.
And we are talking about making things special, making this property, and hopefully, like Pierre Bachelet with Coste de Surnel, instead of 30 hectares, bring up 50 to the final blend. If me, Rebekah, and Pedro achieve that, that will be a fantastic, fantastic achievement in our careers.
So we should start talking about the wine as well. So, and we decided that there's so much to discuss that we're only going to focus just on one wine, the 2016. We actually, when we did the vertical tasting that Rodrigo just mentioned, we tasted Quintessa all the way back into the 1990s. And the thing that really stood out to me about the 2016 was that there was this sort of profound transparency to it, where the Quintessa has always been a beautiful wine. And another important lesson of that tasting was how incredibly well it ages. The wines all the way back still had so much more time left to go. They could just, we could keep drinking them for a long, long time. But the thing about the 2016 was that it felt released from winemaking, if that makes sense. So it's this sort of funny thing where the winemaking was done so deftly. When I tasted it, I felt like I was tasting a site rather than tasting the winemaking. And that was an important difference. But one of the things I want to ask Rebekah if you would talk about, because part of what I hear implicit in what everyone is saying is a really, again, I think so much of wine comes down, we tend to get caught talking on techniques like Rodrigo was just saying, but actually a lot of what changes the quality of a wine is actually in the shift of perspective, right? So with what Rodrigo was just saying, it's very easy to look at an estate that was planted at a particular moment in time and recognize we have more knowledge now. And so to wish, oh shoot, we should have planted it that way then. But of course we couldn't. And sometimes someone might think, oh, well, we'll just replant it and we'll replant it to the knowledge we have now. Except that, of course, means you're always chasing the same problem, because in 20 more years, you'll look back and you'll have different knowledge again. And so the perspective shift that you're talking about is about saying, wait, how do we take what is there already and simply keep improving our understanding of it? But part of what I think is interesting in what each of you are saying is that there's this implicit contrast of perspective from what I often hear in wine. In wine, we're often talking about, here's a site and I want this kind of wine, so we're going to plant these varieties and the site will give me this. And it's more of like a transactional exchange. I want this, so the site will give me that. But part of what I hear in what each of you are saying is this sort of recognition of I'm part of a relationship that results in a wine. You know, and the relationship is with the vines, with the place, with the soils, with the mountains, with the river, you know, with the complexity of the site, with the way it was planted at the time, with the history of the place, with this increase in knowledge, like Rodrigo mentioned. But I know, Rebekah, that your understanding of that relationship you have with Quintessa has really changed over time, and especially as you've been working with Rodrigo and as you've been working with Pedro. Could you speak to that change in perspective and how that your understanding of that relationship to place in order to make the wine has evolved?
Yeah, thanks. So it is, I think of it very much as a relationship, a very intimate relationship. And that, as Pedro was saying, this is such a complex property. And it's a property with very strong terroir, which is wonderful, but it requires a lot of listening, a lot of walking around, talking to people who our vineyard team has been here and on average for 15 years, talking to everyone, hearing what this property wants to say and making smaller and smaller sections so that I can acknowledge, recognize, listen to the difference of the property and allow those differences to shine in those particular lots of wine that we make, and then the blend itself will express the whole property. So with working, you know, with this property for many years, walking with it so many times, and having these really intense conversations with Rodrigo and with Pedro, it just I firmly believe that part of the terroir is their soils, the grapevines themselves, having been growing now for 25 years, fully understanding their own terroir, but it's also the people and the culture that a property like this brings. You know, I think that strong terroirs or a property like Quintessa that has this soul, it has attracted people who like to have these conversations, like to think different, like deeply, like to listen to the oak woodlands and see how, because I would say when I walk through these oak woodlands, that is what Quintessa is. That is the terroir. That is what I want Quintessa to taste like, is to taste like this natural land. And so how do we do that? Is we dig holes, we look underground, we listen to the vines every year, see how they're growing, see what they want to say. And then, you know, I think what you said about this wine is like the highest compliment for me as a winemaker is if I have done everything right, you shouldn't think I did anything at all. Mm-hmm. Like I want to kind of erase myself from it. And it's an incredible honor to be able to do that, to be part of a property like this.
Pedro, one of the things that has been so fascinating for me to, you know, I've been able to walk and travel multiple regions around the world with you as well, and really like walk into soil pits and be covered in dirt, and then covered in dirt go out to eat and drink wine together. But the again, talking about that sense of perspective, with the different tiny little parts of Quintessa that we've been referencing, one of the things you've talked about is how, this block, it's Cabernet, but actually there's something about it that's more like Nebbiolo. So you can't make it all the same. You have to adjust your farming, but you also have to adjust how you bring it into the cellar. So could you speak to that perspective and how you help Quintessa like really understand, let's look at what's here and our relationship to it, and fine tune it all the way through into the cellar as well?
What I think is that through my experience, not every grape can match the same soil. So some soils don't like this kind of grape, other soils prefer this kind of grape. It's very related with the fertility and the fertility, means the minerals and the water holding capacity that you're going to have in every site. So that was why I was saying, it's your terroir that is going to allow you to make the wine, with one typicity. You may try to change that situation. You can try to force, the wine to be in another with another typicity in another way. And even if you try, you won't be able to do it because the site is too strong. So being said that, I will say that at the same time, when you got this great property with the different expressions, you need to think in the long term, European long term, knowing that this is a very European terroir in the sense that there is a lot of stones, and the typicity that you're going to bring from that property is a more European typicity. It's not, a simple, more broad, plush black fruit. This is going to be more complex. So the typicity is, to me, it's an opportunity because not many wines from Napa go to export. This wine should be easily able to go to many countries in the world because you will get something that is not about Cabernet Sauvignon, it's not about Merlot, it's not about Carmener, it's really about the site, and the site is a strong site. I use the word energy a lot because I think there is a lot of energy in that place. So when I was saying, thinking on Nebbiolo, I mean, there are many, if you go to Barolo, you will see that Nebbiolo has always very high vigor and grows, in this kind of deep limestone that you find there, and it would be a mistake to think, this is a bad terroir because the vigor is so high. It should be high because the soil is like that, Barolo is not Burgundy. Burgundy is the opposite. The rocks are very, very hard, difficult to break, so fertility is lower. So here we need to, because we have, I fell in love in a place that in the last time with this white ash that is fantastic. It's more difficult because it's not flat, it's rolling hills, So when you are in the rolling hills, you're going to have some part here, and some part in the bottom. So the geology is the same. But it's a place that you can understand. It's a place with character, European place. You can easily make a bad wine because you have differences in the place. It's highly composed on silt, make me think of La Rioja, very silty white. And so silt is more difficult. Silt makes chalky tannins, so mid palate and finesse, but you can get that with dry tannins as well. So that's why this white terroir is more difficult than a gravel. Gravels have stones. Gravels are fantastic terroir, but remember, in Medoc you need to blend.
Right.
There is no single vineyard in Medoc. And they know that. And the question is why they blend. Is because they like to blend, or is because they need to find a complexity through blending, you know? So that is the thing. So gravels are great terroir, fantastic for Cabernet Sauvignon. You need to have different options, different colors to blend. And then we need to figure out how to add this kind of pepper or salt, you know, to the blend with this white special place, you know. That is the thing to me.
Right. So Rodrigo and Rebekah, like as you get to know these different parts of the vineyard, really getting to know the details of the place, you do have to make choices to then bring the fruit into the cellar and think about, you know, different levels of extraction, but also different types of vessels, you know, and then both in terms of fermenting and in terms of aging. So can you speak just briefly about how are you making choices in terms of amount of new oak type, you know, because that is, in some ways, that's the most obvious cellar influence. So can you comment on that? How do you kind of make those choices in order to balance this real desire to express the place, and yet also obviously you must make choices in the cellar to do that?
Yes. You know, the white soils of our property that Pedro was talking about are about a third of the property, and they're so incredibly interesting, and they're so incredibly difficult to understand and difficult to farm. And they have this incredible fine chalkiness, which could potentially become hardness and dryness. Right. And so the challenge is to understand the differences of these not very big blocks and have to subdivide them even farther to get just the best part of it, the cream part of it. And then how to treat it in the winery. And walking with Pedro last year and digging that pit, and he said, it's, oh, you know, Rebekah, this is like Nebbiolo tannins. That was just this light bulb moment for me, because it's exactly right. These tannins of this part of the property are not like typically what we think of for Cabernet. So it's not about density and power. And so you have to understand that, and that understanding follows into the winery. So in terms of fermentation temperature, I like to match that part of the property with concrete tanks, because I think it accentuates this character. Right. I don't want to hide the character. I want to accentuate the character.
Right. So just to clarify, the finer, lighter boned, chalkier tannin, you're matching with concrete tanks rather than with oak.
Yes, rather than with oak fermenters. Yeah. But it is going into barrels. So I use French oak barrels. In my time here, I have lowered the new oak percentage down, because I think that the fruit here can stand on its own. So the 2016 that we're tasting is about 70%. So it's not nothing, but it's lower than 85%. And using different cooperages and different forest origins for the little plots, the little different sections. So this is going to be a lifelong work to try and understand the property, to work with it in the vineyard, into the winery, and have this be this incredible holistic understanding that will show in the wine. So we're working on it.
Well, and so just because someone's asking to, my understanding is that in terms of fermenter types, you know, concrete is a good match for those chalkier tannin blocks, but then something like a little more clay loamy area would also do well in oak. Would you agree with that?
I would.
Or like a fruitier block would match the oak?
A fruitier block I tend to match actually with stainless steel to get just the freshness.
Right.
And then for the oak fermenters, I use fermentation in barrels as the oak component. And for me, that matches really well with the central hills of the property that are also volcanic soils, but not the white ash. They're a little more red. They have a higher mineral content, and they produce fruit and have this character of this intense tightness, core, tannin, and minerality. And I find that the barrels, the oak fermentation, kind of holds all that tannin together, really shows that. But also kind of tempers its tendency to be too much, like too much of an iron fist.
Right. Rodrigo, could you speak briefly to how in working with Pedro and really kind of intensifying your awareness of the complexity of the site, how has that shifted the way you're approaching the farming?
Well, I was thinking about what Pedro was saying before, and I remember when we were in the pit, in exactly the place that where Pedro and Rebekah are talking about, and we were looking at the root system, and the roots were surrounded by this silt around it that feels like a kind of a talcum powder. And Pedro, at that moment, and it reminds me a few other quotes that I have heard in my life from predecessors or from other persons that I respect a lot. But he said, if you're a vine root, how would you feel in the middle of the summer if you're in the middle of that silt? Mm-hmm. It feels dry, right? Mm-hmm. And he said, after that, you're going to get dry tannins if you don't get this to survive and to irrigate correctly. When I changed, and let me change the subject for 1 second. When we were talking with Simonette and Serge for our pruning techniques, and they were talking to us and they were kind of sculpting, making the same symbol when they were touching the vines to understand the subflow, to know exactly where to make the cuts. They were talking and they mentioned to us, and he said, Rodrigo, you gotta think like a vine. When we were talking with Alan York many times, with Pedro as well, he always mentioned to us, if you don't understand what the vine is feeling, you will never figure it out how to make the best expression of that place. And it talks a lot about, and I mentioned this with frequency, it talks about, it's not about how much we know, it's how much we feel and how much we can observe. It's leaving our ego of the knowledge aside, mm-hmm. and put yourself in the position of a plant and try to interpret what that plant is feeling at that moment in that soil, with that environment, with that particular farmer taking care of it. I think that's the key for us to continue with this evolution in terms of understanding every site at a very, very high level of detail.
Right, really getting very specific. So we are almost out of time, but there's one more question, which is a little challenging to answer. But Pedro, you work with, winery programs and vineyard projects literally all over the world, and at very different scope and scale and size. And one of the questions that is coming in is that the more detailed we get, the more the implication is the more expensive things get too, right? And so how do we balance projects that want to have this real care for a place, yet also must remain more affordable, for example? Can you speak a little bit to how do you approach hitting that balance for different kinds of projects are going to hit at all different levels? How do you find the balance of
it is one of the most difficult part of a consultant. It's the more psychological part of the situation, where you need, when you start working with somebody, you need to understand really well what he wants to do and what he can do. Yes. So you need to know that since day number 1 or day number 2, because everything's about the scale problem. When I was saying we're going Burgundy, I'm saying that we are working really with small scales. So that's going to that means separate your vineyard, in the really very detailed micro terroir, but at the same time, not everybody in the world can do that. Of course, it depends on where you are, on what you want, on also on the price and the cost of your labor and the price of your wine that you're going to sell. I mean, there are many information about it. But how I will say, my number one point when I work in a situation like that is trying to first understand the whole property in terms of geology. And very simple. We have 1 geology, 2 geology, 3 geologies in the property, 4 geologies. It depends where you are, So because the geology is going to make, it's like selecting the music, So we have limestone, it's like we're listening to jazz. We have granite, we're going to blues. This is so immediately when you know the geology, you know the music that you're playing, and you know as well the problems that you can face with that. So if you don't have the option, to go very detailed, then the number one thing is to say, okay, my property is 24 hectares, and I have 5 hectares of stony basalt. Then we have 7 hectares of iron basalt. Then we have 3 hectares of transitional soil, and then the last 5 hectares are clay. So that already makes you 4 different wines, 4 different terroir, basically, 4 different interpretation of the problem. And then when you get that, you try, of course, to understand the typicity of the terroir, the typicity of the wine that each terroir is going to provide, and also what the owners want to make. If the owner says to me, Pedro, I really like the wines like that, blah, 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 and I spend my life drinking wines of Christophe Roumier, you immediately know what he likes. So if the guy tells you that he likes that, forget clay, forget the bottom part of it. It will never happen there. So immediately you have 4 hectares out of the problem. You can do your entry level there or wherever. And then if you understand what he really wants, you say, okay, the guy really likes the style of Chambord-Musigny wines. So we're going to go to the more stony place. So we're not going to approach micro terroir, the 20 hectares. We're going to approach micro terroir only 3 or 4 hectares, and the rest more expensive. And this is going to be more intense because in that place, stony basalt is where we can find what the owners has.
Right.
So you create hierarchy, but there is no, that is the problem with people that is specialized on soil. You cannot do this consulting on terroir if you are not specialized on wine and wine typicity. Right. You need to drink wine to understand what the winemaker or what the owners want to do. That is the real problem, the complexity on everything.
Right. Sometimes over specializing removes you from the big picture. So you can't, so all your tools and techniques actually stop working for you because they're not connected well enough to the big picture. So one last little comment that I want to point out, Quintessa has a little bit of Carmenere in it. And it's just a touch, but it's such a nod to the history of the family. Rebekah or Rodrigo, do either of you want to comment on that just briefly before we finish?
Well, as Rebekah described it earlier, I mean, it's the Chilean connection, the legacy of Agustin Sr. Earlier on in his career, he was a partner owner and president of Conchitoro. And at the time, Conchitoro has a very incredible vineyard in Pelmo, which is actually from where they make part of Almaviva today. Mm-hmm. And there's an incredible vineyard there that is a very old Carmenere. So some of the cuttings of one of the oldest blocks come from there. And there's another small block in the property that comes from a property that the Huneeus family owned a little more recently. It's called Neyen, which is a very unique piece of land in the heart of Apalta. And those cuttings come from that old Carmenere as well. So we have a little bit of those both really interesting vineyards. And of course, it's going to be up to Rebekah how she utilized those, as Pedro was saying, those spices in the final blend. But obviously, it's it's a fun thing to have, and I think gives the wine a little bit of charm as well, and from the legacy of the family. I think it's a very nice thing to have.
It's great. I am so appreciative of being able to have this conversation with the three of you. I just think, again, there's such an opportunity for thinking about how does a team work together, but it also reflects, I think, Quintessa, my understanding is Quintessa has always come from that holistic perspective. How do we fine tune with a holistic perspective? And so in wanting to speak with you, it felt so important to show the holistic perspective by talking to the team, not just one person. And so I appreciate each of you being willing to do that. And Pedro, again, thank you so much for dialing in from Chile. That's, again, one of the advantages of this format is we can show the international perspective by all coming together this way. So thank you very much for everyone that's attended. I hope you enjoyed this session, and thank you again to the three of you for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elaine. Real pleasure.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you. Thank you to our panel. A recording of today's webinar will be published to the California Wine Institute's YouTube channel in the next couple of days, and all participants will receive an email with the link. So we hope you all will join us next week. It's a new chapter of Behind the Wines, and to kick it off, we will welcome Rajat Parr of Domaine de la Côte and Sandy Wines for the episode on Tuesday, July 7th at 10 a.m. So thanks again to our panel, to Elaine, and to all of you for joining us today.
Thank you.